It was a typical spring day in the bustling city where Arthur, a 15-year-old teenager with observant eyes and a generous heart, made his way to the fancy restaurant where his father, Eric, worked as a cook. The streets were crowded, with hurried people barely noticing the world around them, each absorbed in their own thoughts and concerns. As he crossed the corner of Maple Street and Lincoln Avenue, a hunched figure caught Arthur's attention. Leaning against the red brick wall of an old building, an elderly man with gray hair and a face marked by life's adversities extended a trembling hand, holding a crumpled paper cup. His worn and dirty clothes told stories of better days long past. With a hoarse and low voice, he pleaded, "Please, a little help to buy something to eat. It's been days without a decent meal." People passed by him as if he were part of the urban scenery, indifferent to his pleas. The scene broke Arthur's heart, who could never ignore the suffering of others, a quality he had inherited from his father. He stopped, his blue eyes full of concern. "Hello, sir, can I do something to help?" Arthur asked, approaching the man cautiously. The old man looked up, surprised by the attention. "Oh, young man, I didn't expect anyone to stop," he said, his voice a whisper of gratitude mixed with resignation. "Anything would help, son." Arthur looked around thoughtfully. He knew that inside his father's restaurant, high-quality leftover food was often discarded, food that could sustain someone like this man for days. "My name is Arthur. And yours?" "Stephen," the man replied with a faint smile, the first glimpse of warmth in his sad eyes. "Stephen, I have an idea. Why don't you come with me? My father works at a restaurant nearby. I know he can help," Arthur proposed, confident. Stephen hesitated, clearly not accustomed to receiving offers of help. "Do you think that wouldn't be a bother? I don't want to cause any trouble." "Don't worry about it," Arthur reassured him with an encouraging smile. "My father is the best cook you can imagine, and he always says that good food should not be wasted. Let's go, it's not far." Comforted by Arthur's sincerity, Stephen accepted the young man's outstretched hand to stand up. Together, they began walking toward the restaurant, Arthur sharing stories about his father's culinary adventures to distract Stephen from his immediate worries. As they neared their destination, Arthur felt a mix of anxiety and hope. He knew he was about to break the restaurant's unwritten rules by bringing a stranger to the back, but the conviction in his eyes reflected the deepest lesson his father had taught him. True kindness is an act of courage and compassion. This decision would mark the beginning of a chain of events that neither of them could foresee, unleashing a story of revelations and redemption that would unfold in the chapters to come. As Arthur and Stephen approached the restaurant, the noise of the bustling streets gave way to the soft hum of conversations and the occasional clanging of pots and dishes coming from the kitchens of the establishment. The aroma of fresh herbs and baked goods filled the air, promising a feast for the senses. "My father has always believed that no food should go to waste, especially when there are so many who have nothing," Arthur shared as he guided Stephen through less crowded streets, avoiding curious glances. "When I was younger, he would take me with him to distribute leftovers on cold winter days." Stephen, walking alongside the young man with a new glimmer of hope in his tired eyes, listened attentively. "You're lucky to have a father like that. Generosity is a rare gift these days," he said, adjusting his tattered scarf around his neck. The conversation then took a deeper turn. "It wasn't always like this for me, you know," Stephen began, his gaze drifting into distant memories. "I once had my share of good days, golden days, if you will." Arthur looked at him with interest. "What do you mean? You lived well before." "Oh yes, quite well," Stephen replied with a sigh. "I had a large house, cars, parties, even a boat. But I trusted the wrong person, an old friend I thought I could call a brother." His face hardened as he recalled the betrayal. He took everything through false investments. It was so quick, like a house of cards in the wind. "That's terrible," Arthur murmured, feeling a mix of anger and pity for the man beside him. "And there was no one to help you afterward?" "No one who was willing or that I wanted to trouble," Stephen explained, shrugging. Pride, perhaps, or just despair. But it's strange, you know? Losing everything showed me who I really was and who really cared about me. I think I understand, Arthur responded, reflecting on Stephen's words. My father always says that people's true colors shine brightest in times of crisis. They continued their conversation, each word exchanged building a bridge of understanding and mutual respect. Arthur felt increasingly certain that his decision to help this stranger was right, reaffirming his faith in the fundamental goodness of people. Finally, they arrived at the back of the restaurant. A discreet service door marked the separate entrance for deliveries and staff. Arthur stopped, placing his hand on the doorknob. Wait here a second, Stephen. I'll check if my dad is inside. He'll know what to do. Stephen nodded, clearly grateful yet also nervous. Thank you, Arthur. I don't know how I can repay. There's no need to repay, Arthur interrupted with a smile. Helping is enough for me. With those words, Arthur entered the restaurant, leaving Stephen outside with his thoughts and a growing sense that perhaps, just perhaps, his luck was about to change. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was bustling, with cooks and waiters moving in a ballet of efficiency and urgency. Arthur deftly maneuvered among them, looking for his father among the sea of white uniforms and stained aprons. Has anyone seen Eric today? Arthur asked one of the cooks, a young man named Lucas who was skillfully filleting a fish. He was here a minute ago, Lucas responded without looking up. Should be in the storeroom, checking the orders for the night. Thanking him with a nod, Arthur hurried toward the storeroom, determined to find his father and explain the situation. As he moved, the scent of fresh herbs and spices gave way to the smell of paper and ink from the administrative office. Meanwhile, outside, Stephen watched people passing by, each absorbed in their own lives, oblivious to the small scene of compassion unfolding next to the luxurious restaurant. He waited, not without a dose of anxiety, hoping Eric could and would help. As Arthur disappeared through the back door of the restaurant, Stephen remained outside, observing the sporadic movements of employees coming and going. He adjusted his old coat against the wind that was starting to blow colder, a reminder that autumn was nearing its end. The yellowed leaves danced across the ground, following the breeze that carried with it the smell of food being prepared. Inside the restaurant, Arthur moved purposefully through the corridors he knew so well. He passed by the assembly line where dishes were skillfully prepared and decorated before being served to customers. The noise of the kitchen was a mix of quick commands and the clinking of utensils. Arthur eventually spotted Kevin, one of the older cooks, who was organizing ingredients for the evening's dinner. Kevin, have you seen my dad around here? Arthur asked, approaching him with an anxious expression. Kevin, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard and perceptive eyes, looked at Arthur through his glasses. Ah, Arthur. Your dad was just here. He went to check on some deliveries in the storeroom. He should be back any moment, he replied, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Thanks, Kevin. I need to talk to him, it's important, Arthur said, his voice conveying an urgency that made Kevin frown with concern. Is everything all right, Arthur? Any problems? Kevin inquired, his curiosity evident in his tone. It's about a matter of helping someone. I'll explain better with my dad, Arthur responded, avoiding going into details at that moment. I understand. Well, your dad has always had a big heart. I hope everything works out, Kevin said with an encouraging smile, returning to his previous task. Arthur nodded and moved away, now heading toward the storeroom. He opened the heavy door that led to a room lit by fluorescent lights, where several boxes were stacked up to the ceiling and fresh ingredients were organized on shelves. Eric, Arthur called out, his voice echoing slightly among the shelves. I'm here, son. Eric's voice answered from the back of the room. The robust man with graying hair emerged from behind a shelf, holding a box of vegetables. What happened, Arthur? You look worried. Dad, it's a long story. There's a gentleman outside. He needs help, Arthur began, and quickly told Eric about the encounter with Stephen and his request for help. Eric listened attentively, his eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and compassion. "Of course we'll help, Arthur. It's the right thing to do. Let's see what we can prepare for him. You know I can't resist helping those in need, even if it sometimes puts us in a tough position here," Eric said, placing the box on the floor and preparing to follow Arthur back to the back of the restaurant. "Thank you, Dad. I knew I could count on you," Arthur replied, relieved and proud. Together, father and son walked back through the kitchen, passing cooks and helpers who were busy with their tasks. They reached the back door that led to the small space where Stephen was waiting patiently, hope rekindling in his heart as he saw Arthur return accompanied. "Stephen, this is my dad, Eric." "Dad, this is Stephen." Arthur made the introductions, a welcoming smile on his face. Eric extended his hand in a friendly gesture. "Hello, Stephen. Arthur told me a bit about your situation. We'll take care of you today." Stephen, touched by the warm welcome, could barely find the words. "Thank you so much, gentlemen. You have no idea how much this means to me," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't mention it. Let's find something for you to eat now," Eric said, leading the trio inside the restaurant. As they walked, Arthur and Eric quickly discussed the food options available, planning the best way to help Stephen without attracting unwanted attention. Eric was about to reveal more details about the restaurant's policies, which could complicate his decision to help, when they were interrupted by the arrival of one of the managers. The atmosphere changed immediately, foreshadowing the complications that were to come. With the commanding presence of a man accustomed to ruling the kitchen, Eric guided Stephen and Arthur back to the comforting warmth of the restaurant, away from the cold that was beginning to set in outside. The bright lights of the kitchen reflected on their determined faces as they moved among the curious cooks and helpers who cast discreet glances their way. "Stephen, why don't you sit here for a moment?" "Arthur, help him get settled," Eric said, pointing to a small bench near the prep area. Arthur nodded, assisting Stephen to sit down. The elderly man looked around, visibly impressed and somewhat intimidated by the frenzy of the professional kitchen. Eric then turned to the cabinet where they stored meals that had been prepared but not served. He carefully selected a few dishes that were still perfectly good for consumption but could not be served to customers the following day, according to the restaurant's standards. With a plate of mushroom risotto and a piece of roasted chicken, he approached Stephen. "Here, Stephen. This should be enough to satisfy your hunger. Please eat," Eric said, extending the dishes to the man. Stephen looked at the food with eyes that sparkled, not just from hunger, but also from gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he murmured, accepting the food with trembling hands. "No need to thank us. Just enjoy the meal. Everyone deserves a hot dish, especially on a cold day like today," Eric responded, smiling. As Stephen ate, Eric pulled Arthur aside to a corner of the kitchen, away from curious ears. "Arthur, you did well bringing Stephen here, but we have to be cautious. Frank, the manager, has been very strict about not allowing food to be taken outside. He thinks it might attract more homeless people and that could create a bad image for the restaurant," Eric explained in a low voice. "I understand, Dad. But it was the right thing to do," Arthur responded, glancing worriedly at Stephen. "Yes, it was. And that's why we need to keep this among ourselves," Eric affirmed, looking around to ensure they were truly alone. That's when he spotted Kevin, who was organizing kitchen utensils not too far away. Eric gestured discreetly for Kevin to come over. The man approached, curious and somewhat cautious. "Kevin, I need a favor. What we're doing here, it's not exactly approved by management. Can you ensure this stays just between us?" Eric asked, the seriousness of his voice indicating the importance of the request. Kevin, who had always respected Eric as a chef and as a man, nodded understandingly. "Of course, Eric. Don't worry, I won't say a word. And good job helping the gentleman," he said, casting a sympathetic look toward Stephen. "Thank you, Kevin. I knew I could count on you," Eric replied, a slight sigh of relief escaping his lips. With the issue of discretion temporarily resolved, Eric turned his attention back to Stephen, who was finishing his meal. The relief in his eyes was palpable, and the atmosphere in the kitchen felt a bit lighter for a moment. However, the peace was fragile. As Eric pondered the implications of what he had just done, an imposing figure appeared at the entrance of the kitchen. It was Frank, the manager, whose presence always brought a certain tension to the air. Eric set his expression firm, bracing for what was to come, as Frank began to walk in his direction, with a look that promised to complicate matters further. The restaurant pulsed with the energy of peak hours. The noise of conversations mixed with the sound of cutlery and dishes, creating a constant buzz that filled the atmosphere. In the kitchen, the air was thick with contained tension, especially near the area where Frank, the manager, approached Eric with firm steps and a charged expression. Eric, noticing Frank's approach, straightened up and prepared to face any reprimand that might come. Beside him, Arthur looked on with concern, while Stephen, oblivious to the impending discussion, finished his meal, absorbed in gratitude for the food received. "Good afternoon, Frank. How can I help you?" Eric started, trying to keep his voice neutral. Frank stopped in front of Eric, crossing his arms. "Eric, I've been hearing concerning rumors about you distributing food again. You know we have clear policies against this. I can't allow the restaurant to become a gathering point for the homeless," he said, his voice low but loaded with authority. "Frank, I understand your concerns, but it was an emergency situation. The man was starving, and—" Eric tried to explain, but was interrupted. "Rules are rules, Eric. We cannot make exceptions," Frank cut off, his hard gaze fixed on the cook. As Eric and Frank discussed, Kevin watched from a distance, the internal conflict evident on his face. He had promised Eric to keep the secret, but the ambition within him was growing stronger. Kevin had long coveted Eric's position as the head chef, and the opportunity to advance seemed within his reach. Taking a deep breath, Kevin discreetly stepped away and walked towards Frank's office. His steps were hesitant, but the decision was made. Upon reaching the office, he knocked lightly on the door before entering. "Frank, can I talk to you for a moment?" "It's about Eric," Kevin said, closing the door behind him. Frank, who had temporarily left Eric to attend to other matters, turned around surprised. "What's happened now?" I saw Eric giving food to a homeless man. I know he's been warned about this before." "I thought you should know," Kevin reported, his voice trembling, not entirely hiding his hesitation. Frank frowned, irritation evident. "This is serious, Kevin. I appreciate you informing me. Eric is an excellent chef, but we cannot tolerate repeated disobediences. It could damage the reputation of the restaurant," he responded, pondering the implications. Kevin nodded, feeling a mix of satisfaction and guilt. "I just want what's best for the restaurant, Frank. And if you need someone to take on more responsibilities, I'm here," he added, trying to appear more confident. "We'll see how we handle this, Kevin." "Thank you for coming to talk to me," Frank said, giving him a nod before leaving the office to confront Eric once again. With the seed of betrayal already sown, Kevin watched Frank walk away, feeling the weight of his actions. He knew he had crossed a line, but ambition sometimes required tough choices. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Eric awaited Frank's return, knowing the situation could quickly deteriorate. He glanced at Arthur and Stephen, his expression laden with the concern of someone who anticipates an approaching storm. The walls of the kitchen seemed to shrink under the mounting tension. Eric, still holding a tray, turned to face Frank, who was marching towards him with a stormy expression. The restaurant staff, sensing the imminence of a storm, began to slow their pace, their attention diverted from work to the drama unfolding. "You never learn, do you, Eric?" Frank growled, his words slicing through the heavy air of the kitchen. His eyes were fixed on Eric, and his voice, though low, carried a fury that made his entire body seem to vibrate with indignation. Eric, holding Frank's fierce gaze, responded calmly, despite the adrenaline pulsing through his veins. "Frank, I was just trying to help a man in need. I didn't think." "You didn't think?" "That's exactly it, Eric. You never think of the consequences," Frank interrupted, raising a hand as if to silence any defense. "You're jeopardizing the reputation of this restaurant with your good deeds. This isn't the first time, and I warned you it would be the last." Arthur, watching the interaction from a few steps away, felt a mix of anger and fear bubbling within him. Seeing his father treated this way was more than he could bear silently. "But Dad was just being humane," Arthur spoke up, his voice trembling with emotion. "He was doing what's right." Frank turned abruptly towards Arthur, his eyes sparkling with new intensity. "And you, young man, should learn not to get involved. This is a matter between your father and me, and the management of this establishment." Turning back to Eric, Frank continued, his voice rising in volume, drawing the attention of everyone in the kitchen. "Eric, you're fired. Take your things and leave. I don't want to see you in this restaurant anymore." A murmur of shock ran through the team. Some exchanged worried glances, while others lowered their heads, uncomfortable with the situation but fearing to get involved. Eric, for a moment, seemed to lose his breath. He looked around, meeting the faces of his colleagues, some of whom he had known for years. With a resigned nod, he responded, "If that's how it must be, Frank. But know that I have no regrets. Not when it comes to helping someone in need." "This isn't charity, Eric. This is a business," Frank retorted, gesturing around. "And in my business, the rules are clear." Without another word, Eric removed his apron and placed it on the countertop. With one last look at Arthur, who was struggling to hold back tears, Eric walked towards the locker room to gather his things. Arthur, standing still, felt each gaze that fell on him as if it were an accusation. The silence that followed his father was deafening, and the sadness over his departure mixed with a fierce anger against the injustice of the dismissal. Yet, as Eric passed by his son, he managed to muster a sad smile. "Don't worry, Arthur. Something good will come out of this, you'll see," he murmured before disappearing through the door leading to the locker rooms. Arthur, now alone in the center of a kitchen that suddenly seemed very hostile, felt the weight of the situation beginning to press on him. He knew something needed to be done, but what was not yet clear. The incident with his father would pave the way for challenges and decisions that would shape his own character and determine his path going forward. The cold light of the afternoon mingled with the twilight as Eric and Arthur left the restaurant, the door closing behind them with a definitively muffled sound. The air was crisp, laden with the scent of impending rain, reflecting the somber mood of the two as they walked in silence. The street was quieter than usual, echoing the emptiness Eric felt inside after losing not only his job, but also the respect he had cultivated in the place he had called home for so many years. It was then that Stephen, the homeless man whose need had triggered the events of that day, caught up with them. His walk was hesitant, each step laden with the weight of his guilt. "Eric, Arthur, I'm so sorry," he began, his words stumbling over his tongue. "I never meant to cause trouble. If I had known..." Arthur, whose eyes were still red and swollen from tears, shook his head, interrupting him. "Stephen, this isn't your fault. It's just that sometimes trying to do the right thing brings more problems than we expect." Eric put an arm around Arthur's shoulders, pulling him close. "Arthur's right, Stephen. You didn't ask to be in this situation. We did what we thought was right. The true measure of a man is not in how he takes advantage of opportunities, but in how he faces adversities." Stephen looked at the ground, clearly struggling to accept the words of comfort. "But look what happened because of me. You lost your job, Eric. And I just wanted a little help. And I would do the same thing again," Eric stated with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "Sometimes, the consequences are a price to pay to maintain our principles." Eric's words seemed to lift some of the weight from Stephen's shoulders, but the air of defeat still hung over him. The trio continued walking, the silence between them now more comfortable, yet still laden with shared sadness. Arthur, feeling a stronger sense of responsibility than ever, wiped away tears that insisted on forming. "Dad, what are we going to do now?" he asked, his voice a whisper barely cutting through the cold air of the approaching night. Eric stopped, considering the question. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to shine through the dispersing clouds. "We'll move forward, son. That's what we always do. And perhaps it's time to think about a new beginning. There are other kitchens, other places that would value a man willing to take risks for others." Comforted by his father's words, Arthur nodded. Together, the three men shared a moment of silence, contemplating the uncertain path ahead. It was a path that promised challenges, certainly, but also the possibility of redemption and renewal. Continuing their way down the street that was slowly filling with the lights of the night, Eric, Arthur, and Stephen advanced together, united by an experience that would change them in ways they could not yet fully comprehend. And as they walked, the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the city and, somehow, promising a kind of cleansing and new beginning for them all. As the rain began to form a silvery veil over the city, Eric, Arthur, and Stephen found refuge under the awning of a closed shop. The soft sound of rain hitting the concrete brought a moment of forced serenity amid the whirlwind of emotions from the day. Eric, still processing his recent job loss, looked at Stephen, whose eyes carried untold stories that seemed to beg to be revealed. "Stephen, you mentioned something about knowing James, Frank's father. How did you meet him?" Eric asked, his curiosity sharpened by an intuition that something bigger was behind the day's events. Stephen sighed, a sound laden with years of regret. James. I met James many years ago when I was a businessman, not much different from him. Back then, I had a comfortable life, a family, and most importantly, a daughter who was the world to me, Diana." Arthur, standing next to his father, listened attentively, sensing the pain that each word brought to Stephen. "What happened to your daughter?" he asked gently. "Diana was young and full of life, but unfortunately, she trusted the wrong people, just like I did. James was charming, convincing. He introduced us to an investment that seemed perfect. I invested almost everything I had, and Diana, she invested too," Stephen continued, his words tinged with sorrow. "But it was all a scam, wasn't it?" Eric deduced, his voice low, mixed with growing anger as he understood the extent of the manipulation. "Yes," Stephen confirmed with a nod. "James tricked us with forged documents. The investment was a front for money laundering. I lost everything, and shortly after, Diana, she passed away." The last word was almost a whisper, lost in the sound of the rain. "Diana passed away," Arthur interjected, the concern evident in his voice. "It was a car accident, or so we were told. But I've always suspected there was more to it, something related to James. I could never prove anything," Stephen explained, each word like a stone in his heart. Eric, reflecting on the revelations, remembered a conversation he had accidentally overheard between Frank and James in the restaurant, laughing about good old times and shady dealings that made them rich. "I heard Frank and James once, talking about how certain incidents from the past helped build their fortune. I didn't know you and Diana were involved," Eric said, the disgust clear in his voice. Stephen looked at Eric and Arthur, a firm determination arising in his weary eyes. "I've spent many years trying to forget, trying to move on. But maybe, with your help, we can find some justice for Diana, for all of us." The three men stood in silence, united not just by the rain falling around them but by a shared resolution to uncover the truth and confront James's corrupt legacy. As they planned their next step, the rain began to ease, signaling the transition to a new phase in their lives where the challenges of the past promised to reveal paths to possible redemption. After the revelations under the still damp awning from the recent rain, Eric, his face marked by ironclad resolve, turned to Arthur and Stephen, who watched him with anticipation. "We need to act, not just for us, But for all those who have been harmed by James and now Frank, Eric began, his voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions he felt. How do you plan to do this, Eric? Arthur asked, concern evident in his gaze. I need to go back to the restaurant. If I can access the security cameras, we might find something that Frank and James don't want the world to see, Eric explained, outlining a sketch of his plan. It won't be easy, but it's the only way we can get the evidence we need. Stephen, despite his fragile situation, nodded in solidarity. I'll do what I can to help. After all, it's also my chance to correct some of the injustices of the past. I'm with you, Dad. We can't let them keep getting away with this, Arthur added, his young face hardened by determination. The following morning, armed with a rudimentary plan, Eric and Arthur approached the restaurant. The establishment was still closed to the public, and the crisp morning air carried a tense quietude. Eric took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the task ahead. Disguised in caps and dark jackets, they entered through the back of the restaurant, taking advantage of the lack of security at that hour. Eric led Arthur through the silent corridors to the office where the security system was installed. Okay, here we go, Eric murmured as he inserted the key he still possessed into the old lock. The office was plunged into dimness, only the soft light from the camera monitor illuminating the space. Arthur stood watch while Eric quickly navigated through the security system. I'm looking for anything in the last few months. Conversations, meetings they thought nobody was watching, he explained, his agile fingers dancing over the keyboard. Anything, Arthur whispered, peeking down the corridor to ensure they remained alone. Here, wait. This is interesting, Eric murmured, pausing a recording where Frank and James appeared in an animated conversation, clearly unaware they were being recorded. We need a copy of this, Eric said, starting to transfer the file to a USB drive he had brought. As the file was transferring, the sound of footsteps in the corridor alerted them. Someone's coming, Arthur whispered, his heart beating faster. Eric quickly removed the USB drive as soon as the transfer was completed. Let's go, we have to get out of here now, he said, guiding Arthur to an emergency exit he knew well. They managed to escape the restaurant with the images they needed, but they knew the real challenge was still to come. Armed with the evidence, they now needed to find the best way to use it, a task that would test not just their courage, but also their cunning and the depth of their resolve. The morning still carried the freshness of dawn when Eric and Arthur, having escaped with crucial recordings, decided they needed more evidence to solidify their case against James and Frank. Knowing the risks, Eric decided it was necessary to make a second incursion into the restaurant to investigate more deeply. Dressed in dark clothes and wearing caps pulled low to hide their identities, they cautiously approached the restaurant. Eric felt a mix of nervousness and determination pulsing through his veins. As they arrived, they noticed unusual activity at the employee entrance. Kevin, the new chef, was issuing orders with an authority that seemed somewhat forced. Eric pulled Arthur behind a nearby parked car, observing, "We need to be careful. Kevin is there, and he won't be happy to see us," Eric whispered. Arthur nodded in understanding. They waited patiently until Kevin re-entered the restaurant before making their move. As soon as they saw an opening, they silently infiltrated through the employee entrance, which Eric knew so well. Inside the restaurant, the corridor leading to Frank's office was strangely quiet. Eric led the way with light steps, each one measured to avoid any sound that might betray their presence. Reaching the office, Eric placed his hand on the doorknob, only to be surprised by a familiar voice behind him. "What are you doing here, Eric?" Kevin appeared in the corridor, his face a mix of surprise and suspicion. Eric turned slowly, facing Kevin with forced calm. "Kevin, I just want to talk to Frank. I need to resolve some outstanding issues." Kevin crossed his arms, clearly unconvinced. "Frank isn't here, and you know you shouldn't be here. You were fired." "I know, Kevin, but these are important matters. Believe me, I don't want to cause trouble. I just need a few minutes," Eric replied, trying to sound as convincing as possible. Kevin hesitated, looking from Eric to Arthur. After a tense moment, he sighed. 5 minutes, Eric. Don't do anything you'll regret. Thank you, Kevin, Eric said, relieved, although he knew he didn't intend to limit his search to just a conversation. As soon as Kevin walked away, Eric quickly entered Frank's office, closing the door behind him. Arthur, keep an eye on the corridor, please. I'm going to look for anything that might help us. Arthur nodded, positioning himself near the door as Eric rifled through Frank's drawers and files. Documents, spreadsheets, correspondence. Eric searched for any indication of illegal activities or any additional proof that could link Frank and James to shady dealings. After a few intense minutes, Eric found a sealed envelope, marked as confidential. Quickly, he opened it, finding inside a series of printed emails and notes discussing dubious transactions and plans to cover up certain financial activities. This could be exactly what we need, Eric murmured, carefully storing the documents. With the evidence in hand, Eric and Arthur prepared to leave the office, ready to face the next challenge in their fight for justice. The task now was to use this information to bring to light the corruption that had poisoned their lives and, possibly, find a path to redemption for Stephen and Diana's memory. As soon as Eric and Arthur began to move away from Frank's office, with the newly discovered documents safely stored, Eric felt a sudden unease. He stopped abruptly, pulling Arthur into a dark corner of the corridor. Something's not right, he whispered, his senses sharpened by years of working in an always unpredictable kitchen. Arthur, following his father's cautious gaze, tried to discern any sign of movement along the silent corridor. What is it, Dad? It was too easy, Eric murmured, his suspicion clearly heightened. Kevin wouldn't give us this much space without a reason. Stay alert. They resumed walking, their steps silent but now with heightened caution. Eric kept his head up, trying to appear unconcerned while his eyes scanned the surroundings. It didn't take long for his premonition to be confirmed. As they turned a corner, Eric spotted the silhouette of Kevin partially hidden behind a slightly open door. The man was watching, his eyes narrowed in concentration, clearly unconvinced by Eric's earlier explanation. Quickly, Eric pulled Arthur into another corridor, whispering, "He's following us. We need to be smarter." Arthur, the nervousness evident on his young face, agreed. "What should we do?" "Let's make him think we are leaving. I need you to go to the entrance and exit. Make noise, let him see you. While he follows you, I'll go back to get the recordings," Eric explained, quickly outlining a distraction plan. Arthur nodded, understanding the need to divide their actions to maximize the chances of success. "Okay, Dad. Be careful," he said, before heading to the entrance, making as much noise as possible with his steps, his heavy breathing purposefully audible. As Arthur executed his part of the plan, Eric sneaked back to Frank's office. With Kevin occupied following Arthur, he had a window of opportunity. He reopened the computer, his breathing controlled as he searched for the audio recordings that could be key to exposing Frank and James's illegal activities. However, the security system was more complex than he expected. The recordings were protected by multiple layers of digital security, and every second Eric spent trying to access them increased the risk of being discovered. Come on," he murmured to himself, typing with a speed that only urgency could provide. After tense moments that seemed to stretch for hours, Eric managed to access the desired files. Quickly, he copied the most compromising recordings to his USB drive, a tremor of relief passing through his body as he saw the progress bar reach 100%. With the USB drive securely stored, Eric prepared to leave the office, knowing that the most critical part of his plan was still to come. With the evidence in hand, he now needed to escape the restaurant without being detected by Kevin or any other employee who might suspect their intentions. The night was adorned in its usual splendor at Frank's mansion, where twinkling lights decorated the grand garden and music softly echoed, creating an atmosphere of elegant festivity. The city's elite had gathered, dressed in their finest attire, each guest displaying a polished smile while holding glasses of champagne. Eric and Arthur, disguised among the waitstaff, circulated discreetly, their attentive gazes observing every movement around them. Eric, with a tray of canapés in hand, kept focused on his mission, to ensure that the recently acquired incriminating documents were delivered to the right people. Arthur, meanwhile, took care of maintaining a low profile as he neared Frank's private office, a location they knew contained more evidence. As the party progressed, Arthur managed to slip into the office, finding a collection of files that seemed promising. Quickly, he began photographing the most incriminating documents with his cell phone, each click adding to his arsenal of evidence against Frank and James. It was then that Kevin, who had been keeping an eye on Arthur since he noticed his suspicious presence, decided to intervene. He abruptly entered the office, finding Arthur bent over the papers. "Arthur, what do you think you're doing?" Kevin asked, his voice a mix of anger and disappointment. Arthur, caught off guard but quickly regaining his composure, put away his phone. "Kevin, it's not what it looks like. I'm just cutting corners. This is theft, Arthur. You're stealing documents from Frank." Kevin interrupted, taking a step toward Arthur. Arthur held his ground, firm. "No, Kevin. I'm trying to expose the truth. These documents, they prove that Frank and James have been involved in illegal activities. People have been harmed, Kevin. My family has been harmed." Kevin hesitated, clearly conflicted. For a moment, the sincerity in Arthur's eyes seemed to reach him. "What if I offer you a way out? You give me those documents and we pretend this never happened. It might be better for all of us." Arthur shook his head, his resolve unwavering. "I can't do that, Kevin. Not while justice hasn't been served. People deserve to know the truth." Kevin, frustrated, ran his hand through his hair. "You're making a big mistake, Arthur. This is going to end badly for you." "I'd rather face the consequences than live with the guilt of not doing anything," Arthur replied, holding Kevin's gaze. Kevin, after a long and tense moment of silence, finally stepped back. "I can't help you, Arthur. But I won't stop you either," he said, before turning and leaving the office, leaving Arthur alone with the documents. With the papers now secure in his possession and more evidence on his phone, Arthur left the office, finding Eric still mingled among the guests. With a discreet nod, he signaled to his father that they had achieved what they came for. Together, father and son prepared to leave the party, aware that the challenges they would soon face were likely to be even more daunting than those they had overcome that night. They knew that the truth was close to being revealed, a truth that could change many lives, including their own. The atmosphere of the party, until then permeated by light laughter and the clinking of glasses, was abruptly transformed by the sound of sirens slicing through the night air. Blue and red lights flashed through the glass windows of Frank's mansion, casting dancing shadows on the surprised faces of the guests. Eric and Arthur, already on their way out, stopped upon noticing the sudden change in the environment. As the guests murmured among themselves, trying to guess the cause of the unexpected arrival of the police, an unforeseen figure made his entrance. Stephen, dressed not in his usual worn clothes, but in a well-fitted suit that outlined his now erect posture, strode through the hall with renewed confidence. His steps were firm, each movement calculated to maximize the impact of his surprising presence. "Stephen!" Eric exclaimed softly, incredulous at the transformation of the man he had known as homeless. All eyes turned to Stephen as he walked directly towards Frank and James, who were conversing with some of the city's influencers. The conversation stopped abruptly as Stephen approached, his gaze fixed on the two men who suddenly seemed cornered. "Good evening, gentlemen," Stephen began, his voice strong and clear, filling the space with its unexpected resonance. "It seems we have much to discuss." Frank, regaining his usual composure, forced a smile. "Stephen, what a surprise to see you here, and so well-dressed. What brings you to my party?" Before Stephen could respond, the entrance of the police officers into the main hall diverted everyone's attention. An older officer, with badges indicating his high rank, stepped forward with a warrant in hand. "We are here for James and Frank," the officer announced, watching the reaction of the two men. "You are being charged with multiple financial crimes, in addition to being linked to the suspicious death of Diana Miller." The accusation seemed to resonate through the hall like thunder, silencing whispers and freezing the party in a state of collective shock. James visibly paled, while Frank tried to maintain a facade of calm, although his hands trembled slightly. "This is absurd," James finally burst out, his voice laden with indignation. "You can't just come here and accuse us without proof." The officer, unperturbed, replied, "We have sufficient evidence to take both of you into custody while we conduct a more thorough investigation. Please cooperate to avoid further embarrassment." As the police moved forward to execute the warrant, Stephen turned to face Frank and James directly. "I promised myself that I would seek justice for my daughter, no matter how long it took. Today, that promise begins to be fulfilled." Eric and Arthur, watching from a safe distance, felt a mix of admiration and relief. The truth about James and Frank's crimes was finally coming to light, thanks to Stephen's courage and determination. With Frank and James being led out of the hall under the astonished gazes of the guests, the party had transformed into a scene of real drama, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of all those involved. The events of that night reverberated like waves in a pond, reaching the furthest corners of the local community. The arrest of James and Frank, two pillars of the city's business elite, dominated conversations in the weeks that followed. As the two men faced the judicial process, the truth about their illicit activities unfolded in sordid details, each revelation more shocking than the last. Meanwhile, Stephen, now vindicated and with his dignity restored, began to rebuild his life with the resources that had been returned to him. After a thorough investigation, authorities had recovered a significant amount of his assets that James had hidden in offshore accounts. With his fortune reinstated, Stephen also regained control of the restaurant that had once been the stage for his greatest losses. A clear spring day marked the ceremony of the restaurant's transfer of ownership. The venue had been temporarily closed for renovations under Stephen's direction and was now reopening under new management. Eric and Arthur, along with other community members and restaurant staff, were present, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and expectation. Stephen, standing before the gathered guests in the newly decorated dining hall, began his speech with a firm but emotionally charged voice. "Today is not only a celebration of a new beginning for this place, but also a deep thanks to those who stood by my side during the most challenging times." His gaze swept over Eric and Arthur, who watched from the front row. "Eric, Arthur, you showed a courage and kindness that redefined what it means to be a friend and a man of principles. Without your help, I might never have seen justice done." Eric, moved, replied, "Stephen, we did what was right. It was an honor to fight by your side." Stephen smiled. "As a sign of my gratitude, and knowing that this place will be in good hands, I have decided to transfer the ownership of the restaurant to you both. Not just as a business, but as a home for the community, a meeting place where everyone is welcome and respected." Arthur, surprised and a little overwhelmed by Stephen's generosity, added, "We will honor this gift, Stephen. We'll ensure that this restaurant is a symbol of integrity, just as you are to us." Warm applause echoed through the hall as Stephen handed over the symbolic keys of the restaurant to Eric and Arthur. The moment was one of celebration but also reflection on the hard lessons learned. In the days that followed, Eric and Arthur worked tirelessly, transforming the restaurant not just into a thriving business but into an active community center, promoting charity events and training programs for young chefs. Stephen's vision of justice and redemption materialized through each dish served and every smile shared among the staff and customers. As the restaurant flourished under its new leadership, the city watched, inspired by a story of overcoming and change. Justice, though sometimes delayed, had been served, and redemption found not just for Stephen but for all those whom the restaurant now served. With the new keys to the restaurant in hand, Eric and Arthur embarked on a journey to rejuvenate not only the physical space but also the spirit and mission of the establishment. They began by renovating the interior, choosing decorations that reflected warmth and welcome, and modernizing the kitchen so that it could serve not only as a place for food preparation, but also as a learning center for aspiring chefs in the community. Eric, dressed in a new apron bearing the redesigned restaurant logo, supervised the kitchen with a mix of pride and responsibility. "We have a chance to do something great here, Arthur," he often said while instructing the staff with a patience he had perfected over the years. Arthur, who had taken on many of the management responsibilities, worked to integrate the restaurant even more into the community. "Let's start a Meals on Wheels program for those who can't leave their homes," he proposed during a staff meeting, receiving nods of approval and enthusiastic smiles from the employees. The restaurant quickly became a beacon in the community, known not just for its culinary excellence but also for its commitment to social justice. Eric and Arthur maintained the tradition of donating leftover food, but they expanded the reach of these donations, working in partnership with local shelters and homeless assistance programs. As for Kevin, after his dismissal, there was a brief period of tension. However, one day, he appeared at the restaurant, a bit hesitant. Eric, always the peacemaker, invited him in. "Kevin, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them," Eric said, offering him a coffee. Kevin, visibly moved, accepted the gesture. "I was wrong, Eric. I'm sorry for what happened. I see now what you're trying to build here, and it's admirable," he admitted, looking around the renovated restaurant. "Thank you, Kevin. The door is always open for you here," Eric replied, extending his hand in a gesture of reconciliation that Kevin accepted, marking a small but significant step towards healing. Over time, the restaurant thrived under the new management of Eric and Arthur. It became more than a place to eat. It was a place where people gathered to share not just meals but stories and mutual support. The success of the restaurant symbolized a new chapter of justice and humanity, a true representation of the changes Eric, Arthur, and Stephen had dreamed of. And so, amid the laughter of satisfied customers and the clatter of dishes being prepared, Eric and Arthur looked to the future with hope, knowing that each meal served was a reminder of their journey, a testament to their struggles, and a symbol of their shared victory.
So, if you're not subscribed yet, click on the subscribe button below and join our community. Thank you for your support and see you in the next videos.